What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we'll be going over my selections for the 5 best value picks in drafts right now. For this video, I wanted to only include players who were going in the later rounds. You can definitely be a really good value in the early rounds, but if we're talking about the 5 best values in drafts, I envision that being a player who could just end up shattering their ADP. You know, a guy who goes 5, 6, 7 rounds earlier next season. And for that to be the case, you have to be going somewhat late in drafts. So for this one, I'm only going to use players currently being taken after the first 10 rounds on pretty much every format. Maybe there's somewhere where like 1 to 2 of these guys are going in the 10th, but I think for all these guys, most of them are going like undrafted in most formats. They're going really, really late. I'm also only going over running backs and wide receivers. They're the ones who typically shatter their ADPs. It's much less likely that a quarterback breaks out that much, especially that a tight end just dominates their ADP. So if that's going to make you sad, you know, because you really wanted some quarterback, tight end sleepers, fear not, the website has more than enough information for you to dominate your draft. We've got the sleepers, targets, avoids, rankings, projections, premium videos, whole lot more. So if you want that, check that out over there, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But for this one, you're getting 3 wide receivers and 2 running backs. So before we get into that, let's start things off as usual, the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was who had the most receptions in a game last season. The answer was Keenan Allen. Jared Roberts was the first to get that one right on YouTube, and Jared Allen, 72, was the first to get that right on Twitter. Today's stat: 3 tight ends had a game last season with at least 13 receptions. George Kittle, Darren Waller, and who was the third? All right, so let's go over the wide receivers first. And first up, we've got our boy Bryan Edwards. Edwards is coming off the board in like the mid-12th round. I believe he's the earliest wide receiver and the earliest player we're going to talk about today. Maybe the 3rd wide receiver we go over is like a few spots ahead of him, but coming off the board mid-12th round on Underdog, but is absolutely free on basically every other platform. Last season, I said that Bryan Edwards was better than Henry Ruggs and would have the better career, and I stand by that take. Henry Ruggs is not a #1 wide receiver, and Bryan Edwards is. And especially in fantasy, Edwards is the one you want, not Henry Ruggs. He's got the frame, 6'3", 212 pounds. He's got the athletic profile. He's got the college production, 94th percentile college dominator rating, 88th percentile college target share. He's got the breakout age being a 100th percentile breakout age. That's insane. He's got enough draft capital going in the mid-3rd round. And then you see, you know, how Derek Carr has been talking about him, and you wonder how he's not going in the 9th or the 10th round on every single site. I think maybe it's because he's on the Raiders, or maybe because he's not a rookie. Like a lot of times rookies get really hyped when there's a lot of excitement about them because it's like, ooh, you know, this is the new shiny toy. We haven't seen this before. We saw Bryan Edwards last season. He didn't do all that great. But last season, he started off like they kind of put him into that role. He was very, very young as a rookie, so he didn't truly break out last season, but they put him into that X role, and then he got hurt, and they had to put Nelson Aguilar into the role, and Aguilar did well. This season, it is very clear. You see the reports from the team. You see Derek Carr speaking. You watch training camp. He is going to be their X receiver. Bryan Edwards is going to be the best receiver on the Raiders this season, and he's such a good talent that I think he's going to really produce in fantasy under that role. And honestly, I just did a draft yesterday that you guys are going to see on Monday. Edwards went for $1. Like if you're in an auction league, you're getting him for $1 or $2. He's free. He's going super late in drafts. You need to be taking him because I genuinely believe he's going to be the X receiver on the Raiders this season, and that's a role that can be very, very friendly in fantasy. Please draft Bryan Edwards late. Another fantastic late round receiver, someone you've heard me mention before, of course, is Jakobi Meyers. Now, I do have to record this. Obviously, it goes up Friday morning. I have to record it before the Thursday preseason game. So if he dies in that game, I don't know about it. Disregard this take, just go on to the next player. But assuming that he's fine after that game, he's just going way too late. you'll see a theme with these wide receiver picks. I guess for these first two, not necessarily for the third. I guess it's possible for the third one, but for at least these first two. Whenever late in the draft you can find a team's #1 wide receiver, you want to be attacking that, right? Because you could be going after maybe like the third best wide receiver on a team, but those guys where the third best wide receiver are typically the third most talented, typically getting the third most targets. And so their floors are absolutely lower when their team performs poorly, because if you're getting like the third most targets, well, that's not fantastic. But also their ceiling is only so high, because even in these games where people are going off, it's like, well, the #1's going off, the #2 is going off, maybe the tight end's going off, the running backs are going off. It's not necessarily the third receiver. And so there's very capped upside and a very low floor when you're targeting the third best receiver on a team, even sometimes the second best. So when we're late in drafts, it is really nice being able to target a team's #1, especially when we're pretty confident that's the case. I'm very confident Bryan Edwards is #1 on the Raiders, and I'm very confident that Jakobi Meyers will be the #1 on the Patriots. And if we're searching for a breakout, it's like, look at what could change, right? Because we saw last season, Meyers had the second highest yardage share on a team. He had, for week 7 on at least, only behind Adams. He had the 10th most yards per route run. He had the 7th highest share of his team's targets. Like, he was a stud from an opportunity standpoint. But look at the offense last season. It was very run heavy, especially in the red zone. And so he has 2 touchdowns, but they're both passing, right? Like he doesn't even have a receiving touchdown. So when you look at that and you say, well, where's the upside? It's like the upside is if any of that changes. It's if Cam Newton improves at all under his second season, or if he's just not the quarterback anymore, because the game plan is completely different under Mac Jones. Mac Jones is not taking off and scrambling every play. Mac Jones is not getting designed running plays or read option looks inside the 5-yard line. A lot of those might turn into pass attempts to Jakobi Meyers. So the touchdowns go up. Between the 20s, you're not seeing as many, again, play action. You're not seeing as many dropbacks that turn into carries. And so the pass attempts increase. Well, now if Meyers is still getting a huge share of his team's targets, but those targets are increasing, well, his ceiling goes much, much higher in fantasy. Those are the players we're targeting. When we think the opportunity is there, we know it's there, and we think that the team is going to improve in that area of the game, well, that's fantastic, especially when you're going as late as Jakobi Meyers. So I believe that Bryan Edwards, Jakobi Meyers are going to be the #1 players on their team, or #1 wide receivers on their team, and so you should really, really be targeting them late in drafts. One receiver that I don't envision as much being the team's #1, at least not yet, maybe in a few seasons he will be, but who I still think has a lot of upside, I'm very excited about this season, is Terrace Marshall. He had a 60-yard reception in his first NFL drive. He was the only rookie in week 1 to have multiple 20-yard receptions. He's very clearly stepping into the role that netted Curtis Samuel 77 receptions for over 850 yards. Plus he had like 200 rushing yards. He had a lot of rushing yards. I don't remember how much it was. But he had a lot of rushing yards. Now, they're going to be different players. So I say he's going to be stepping into the Curtis Samuel role. They're not the same wide receiver. Terrace Marshall is much bigger than Curtis Samuel, and he doesn't necessarily need to play in the slot. So it's not like, oh, here's their new small slot receiver. Like, Terrace Marshall is a big guy. Go look at the highlights. He's a big guy, and he doesn't need to play in the slot. We always reference reception perception from Matt Harmon. He did the breakdown in Terrace Marshall, basically came to the conclusion that it's like, yeah, he can totally play that like big slot role, but you don't need to put him in the slot. You can play him on the outside. And that's very important, because if someone is purely a slot receiver, well, they're just not playing in 2 wide receiver sets. Now, to open the season, I don't expect Marshall to be in 2 wide receiver sets. I think it's going to be DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson. But if you told me, like, who's a wide receiver late in drafts that I think could break out, could overtake maybe Robbie Anderson and become a player they're looking at in 2 wide receiver sets, I think it's Terrace Marshall. 85th percentile speed score, 84th percentile breakout age, 85th percentile burst score, 81st percentile success rate versus man, 86th percentile success rate versus the press. Again, can play on the outside, can play on the inside, can gain separation deep, can gain separation on short routes. He can be used in the red zone because of his frame. Like, he has breakout written all over him. And if whoever the quarterback ends up being, like there's a little bit of controversy over there, like who's going to be the quarterback for the Panthers, but regardless, we think the quarterback play is going to be okay. It's going to be fine. It's not going to be, to the level of like the Packers or the Bucks or the Chiefs, right? We know those teams can have phenomenal quarterback play, but it's not going to be horrible over there in Carolina. And so I don't think we can use quarterback play to say Terrace Marshall cannot break out. I think he's going to have a really, really nice season. It's not going to be right away. Again, it's going to be more to close the season in the second half. But hey, you're drafting him in one of the final rounds anyways. And so who cares, right? You're not drafting your starting wide receivers in like the 12th, 13th, 14th rounds. So why not take a guy who we think will explode down the stretch of the season when the games matter the most? Moving on to running back. I was going to include Philip Lindsay in this because he's still going far too late, but I've already talked about him a lot recently, so I didn't want to. But how about Xavier Jones? Darrell Henderson is very clearly the team's #1 running back, and I think you should be drafting Henderson as well. But that doesn't mean that Jones should be going undrafted. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. When we're looking for massive values at running back late in drafts, you need to understand that like no one in this range is like an incredible talent and has high opportunity, right? Because if that was the case, you'd be going in the early rounds. Anyone with a pulse who's getting volume as a running back is going in the early rounds. So when you're looking at this range, you're not going to find players who are phenomenal talents and are getting like 50% of their team's workload. It's just not going to happen, right? You can occasionally find wide receivers where that's the case, kind of like the guys we just talked about in this video. But at running back, like everyone is searching for a running back because there are so few good ones. And so it's less likely you're going to find amazing talent. Because of that, we need to try and identify like which running backs are on elite offenses and have some sort of path to a lot of touches, especially if it's through an injury. That's the most likely scenario. You could argue that maybe like you want to be targeting players who can break out without an injury, but that's just so unlikely. It just doesn't really happen. You pretty much need an injury for everyone late. So if you need that injury, you want to be targeting players in really good offenses, and you don't want to be targeting players with clearly defined roles. Like you don't want, you can in some builds, especially in full PPR leagues, draft guys like James White, Nyheim Hines, McKissick, Bernard, Gainwell, like especially on sites like Underdog where you're just looking for a few points, maybe in deeper formats in 14, 16 team leagues, full PPR, you can use these guys. But if you're in like a 12 team half PPR league, drafting McKissick, it's like, there's really no point in doing that. You'd rather draft someone who has a much lower floor, but at least has a chance. Because if like Gibson goes down, McKissick isn't going to be some like stud, right? We kind of know what his ceiling is. It's basically what we saw last season. And you're probably not winning a championship if McKissick is your like running back 2 or your flex play in a 12, 10, 18 league, right? Maybe again, if you expand into 14 and 16 teams, full PPR, that could be the case. But we're trying to find players who have a floor of like 30 fantasy points this season, but could break out if things go their way. So when we look at Xavier Jones, everything is pointing to him being the direct backup to Henderson, and they've been very clear that like they want to keep Henderson healthy. They don't want to give him 100% of the workload. They know he's their best guy, but they also know that like if they just give him a ton of carries, a ton of like targets, he's going to get hurt. And then, then what do they do? Now they've, only got Xavier Jones and Jake Funk. And like, as much as I'm saying you want to draft Xavier Jones because that's in the possibility, if you're the Rams, you still don't want that to happen, right? The Rams don't want to only have Xavier Jones and Jake Funk as their running backs, right? That's not something that they want to happen. If you're drafting Xavier Jones, that's probably something you want to happen, but it's not something that the Rams want to happen. They want to have this rotation in there. But if Henderson were to miss any time, Xavier Jones is next in line. And given that, McVay has been very vocal about praising him in pass protection, he's been vocal about saying, like, this kid's going to have a role this season. It's not going to be to overtake Henderson, but it's going to be a role. It very clearly looks like he's the 2. And if we're trying to identify a 2 that's going really late in drafts on a top 7 offense, it's Xavier Jones, because the Rams are going to be very good, and I don't think Funk is all that good, so it's basically him next in line. So if you're in the final round of your draft, you're just looking for someone who could literally, Xavier Jones could score 30 fantasy points this season, But if you're looking for someone who fits that mold, who if it doesn't work out early in the season, you can easily drop and get someone off free agency, I think Jones is your guy. Now, one closing note on Jones. It's very volatile with what the Rams do. So the Rams continue to say that they are not going to sign someone. I believe that's the case with the current free agency market. But if a running back like Mark Ingram or Sony Michel were to get cut and then the Rams go out and they sign them, you need to understand that Jones is just no longer viable. You basically cannot draft him at that point. It would be like pretty guaranteed that Sony or Ingram would be the number 2. So if there's a surprise, those aren't surprise cuts. I think those 2 might get cut. But if there's a different like surprise cut after a few weeks of the preseason, before the season starts, or even like into the season, really, you got to realize that like Jones is no longer viable. But because that's a possibility, I want to go over another running back that you guys can draft late that I really don't think is a risk of like anyone being added in, and that's Rhamondre Stevenson. Like the Patriots are not adding, another running back in free agency. If anything, like I said, I think Sony can get cut. So I really think that Damien Harris is the one, that Stevenson will operate as the number 2, that James White will be like the 3rd down back, and that I truly believe Sony Michel could end up getting cut. And I've been pretty vocal about how I would love if the Patriots, use Damien Harris as a feature back and then he broke out this season. But unfortunately, I don't really see that happening. And the fact that, basically every single fantasy site out there, every channel, every platform, everyone has been hyping up Damien Harris the entire summer, that's what's kept his ADP relatively high. Meanwhile, Stevenson, is a really legit talent. And while there's no way that he takes Harris's job in week 1, he could carve out a pretty large role this season. The Sony Michel pick, though, the Sony Michel was just an embarrassing pick from a Patriots fan standpoint. It was so embarrassing, probably the most embarrassing pick I've seen recently. Obviously the N'Keal Harry pick was awful because literally Deebo Samuel, AJ Brown, DK Metcalf, Deontay Johnson, Terry McLaurin, all those guys were drafted after N'Keal Harry. But I would still say that the Sony Michel pick was worse because it was just, there was no need to make the pick, and he's not all that good. And so what I need you to understand is that you can't think about draft capital as much for the Patriots because Sony Michel could easily get cut, N'Keal Harry could easily get cut even though they're first round picks because the Patriots are so bad at drafting early that for most teams you look at it and you're oh, he's a first round pick, he's probably not getting cut. It's yeah, but the Patriots are so bad at drafting first round picks, especially at skill positions, that yeah, they could very easily get cut. So understand that Sony Michel could not be on this team. And I think that's what's holding a lot of people back from Stevenson. I'm hoping that he doesn't get cut too early because that's going to skyrocket Stevenson's ADP, even though it shouldn't because Sony's not going to be a big part of the game plan. But just know that if that happens, Stevenson's going to be much more expensive. But until that happens, or maybe Sony is just kind of still on the roster, but he's not active on game days, which is the most ideal outcome for us. Assuming that happens, we've got Stevenson here, 5'11", 230 pounds, is a capable receiving back. He's good in the passing game. And in week 1, he was the 4th fastest ball carrier, gaining over 20 miles per hour on his 91-yard rushing touchdown. No other Patriots running back was getting a touchdown on that play. And I think that's something the Patriots are going to look at and be okay, so we've got a guy who very clearly can be a goal line back. He's just a massive guy. The Patriots love having their goal line backs, and so very clearly can be the goal line back. But who's also very quick on his feet. People are comparing him to LeGarrette Blount, but Blount was just a bowling ball. He would just run straight and just run people over and just try and get to the end zone. He's not making people miss with his feet. Stevenson can make you miss. And when you've got that combination of the size, of the receiving skills, of the speed, and you can make someone miss with your feet, that's a dangerous combination. And like we talked about with Jakobi Meyers, everyone assumes the Patriots are not going to be good. Everyone assumes that this Newton-led offense is going to be the same as last year, very boring offense. Newton can steal all the goal line touchdowns. But as they transition into Mac Jones, those goal line touchdowns are going to the running backs. And if Stevenson can carve out a role for himself in that area and eventually maybe overtake Damian Harris, you've got yourself a league winner. And he's not being drafted. So whenever you've got yourself that much upside at the running back position, a position that we don't like very much, right? There's very few running backs that are actually quality in fantasy. That's why you take them early. That's why maybe if you have to, take some in the middle rounds. But you just like end your team with a few deep ones, because it's like, if I can draft, 2 or 3 early and then 2 late, I'm good with it. I want to take other positions because running back is just so horrible, right? Aside from these top end guys. But when you've got someone late that you can count on that has that much upside, you just like have to take advantage of that, because so many of the late round running backs are going to be on free agency in week 2 or week 3. And I don't think that's going to be the case for Stevenson. I think he's a really, really quality pick and someone you can target in basically the final round of your draft. So those are 5 value picks if you are searching for wide receivers and running backs late in drafts. As I said to start this video, if you want to see more late round sleepers, or you want to see some players that I'm targeting in maybe the early, the middle rounds, you can check all that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.